The first body system that we're going to cover in Honors Anatomy is the integumentary system. In the SKIN.1 standard, we're talking specifically about how the three distinct layers of the integument each possess structures and functions that are unique to that individual layer. Your standard reads, I can contrast the dermis, epidermis, and hypodermis with regard to structure and function, and this covers section 6.1 to 6.2 in your textbook. Okay, open up to a fresh, clean page and title it Unit 3, the Integumentary System. So the integumentary system is made of, we said primarily skin, but that includes any of the accessory structures that are embedded in the skin. So your hair on your body, the hair on your head, your fingernails, your toenails, your sweat glands, your oil glands, and then any sensory receptors that can tell your brain that there's been a change in temperature or perhaps some tactile touch. And another name for skin is the cutaneous membrane. There are three major layers on this diagram here. And I will utilize my pen. So the epidermis is the most superficial, and it's pretty thin. It has this wavy basement membrane, and there's not too many structures embedded within it. The dermis is the very large central layer, so a little bit deeper than the epidermis. And that contains a ton of blood vessels. We can see the bulb of a hair root, some glands, some tactile receptors, even a little muscle. This erector pili muscle right here is responsible for propping that hair up and giving someone goosebumps. So a lot of really important structures, but it does not touch or face the outside world. Lastly, the hypodermis, sometimes known as the subcutaneous layer, is the deepest of the three that we're going to discuss, and it contains mostly adipose tissue and areolar tissue, so blood vessels as well as fat for cushion and nourishment. Okay, first subheading, SKIN.1 integument layers. We are going to pick apart each of those three primary layers. So the epidermis, we said, was most superficial. It is composed of epithelial cells. So from our tissue unit, we said the epithelial cells tended to be linings and coverings, and so this is the covering of your body. Largely made up of stratified squamous cells, as we can see here, flat on the outside, maybe more squarish down towards the bottom. But there are many, many layers to offer protection to your body. There aren't blood vessels here, so that means that the only living cells really are in this deepest purple layer, and as these cells divide, they push older cells upwards and outwards, which eventually flatten and die. Your epidermis protects you against losing water. It protects from pathogens entering your body and also any sort of mechanical injury. So really, it's to keep what's inside of you inside and outside out. There are 5 layers within the epidermis alone, and from outermost to deep, we have the stratum corneum, which is completely dead cells here on the outside. Stratum lucidum, which is only found in your thickest skin areas. So the soles of your feet, the palms of your hands, they contain this stratum lucidum. Next, we have the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basal, which is the deepest mitotic layer. These cells are actively dividing. You will have to memorize which order these layers of the epidermis are in, but the only ones you really need to know about are corneum, lucidum, and basal because they have descriptors here. Okay, so found in the stratum basal, that deepest layer here, these purplish cells, we have 2 cell types, and the first is called keratinocytes. And these cells are producing a waterproof protein called keratin that helps keep your moisture inside of you and makes you waterproof to the outside world as well. It's also a hard protein, so it keeps your hair healthy, it keeps your skin nice and tough, because even though we want soft skin, we want it to also be strong, and so keratin does that. Keratinization is a name for the process by which we dehydrate and harden these cells as they migrate outward. So the stratum basal has keratinocytes that are not that hard and are not dead, and then as they move out, they accumulate more and more keratin, and it eventually kills them, and then they become the stratum corneum, that very dead, flat layer. Also in the stratum basal, The other cell type is a melanocyte, and these are the cells that are going to produce our skin pigment. We need pigment in our skin to absorb the UV light that is given off from the sun. That light is capable of damaging our DNA and causing cancers within our body. And even though we do have pigments, a lot of us still are susceptible to skin cancer because we don't have enough or we're getting too much sun exposure. And melanocytes are responsible for either increasing the amount of melanin they're producing or laying off a little bit. So there are two primary human pigments. Eumelanin is the dark brown pigment, and then phenomelanin is a lighter red-yellow. All people have some degree of both, but depending on what your race is and what genes you have, you may have more of one than another. So you may look slightly reddish, slightly yellowish, very dark brown, very light brown. There's a very wide array of skin colors produced from these two types of melanin. Some other factors can affect your skin color too. So hereditary means genetic. Sometimes the melanocytes produce a lot of melanin and sometimes they produce very little. In biology, I know that we discussed how perhaps two biracial parents can have two kids and one would be darker than both parents, one is lighter than both parents. Either way, they have the same number of melanocytes. They're just producing more or less of them. Environmentally, as you get exposure to UV light, it triggers your melanocytes to start producing more. So if you tan outside, if you fake tan inside, you will appear darker. Also, any sort of damage to the skin, x-rays from outer space, x-rays, when you go to the dentist, they like to cover you up with that bib to protect you from x-rays, but ultimately we're not as worried about that as we are UV damage. And then physiological factors, meaning like things you do in your everyday life that can affect your skin color. Oxygenation of dermal blood vessels. When you get hot, you look red, and that is because not anything to do with pigment, but because your blood vessels have risen closer to the surface of your skin to start to release some of that heat, and so we see that reddish in your blood. Whereas when you're colder, people say you look blue, but ultimately you just look more pale. Things you eat can also affect your skin color if you eat them in really high concentrations. So for example, carotene is the pigment that makes carrot orange. And if you eat a lot of carrots or drink a lot of carrot juice, then over time you can accumulate that pigment and have an orangish glow. Okay, the dermis is our middle layer. It's called the inner layer of skin. It contains these very noticeable ridges here where it butts up against the epidermis, and these are eventually what will produce your fingerprints, these ridges right here. The point of the dermis is we are trying to bind that epidermis down. The dermis houses structures, but it's not very protective. It's more just trying to nourish the epidermis, nourish those keratinocytes and melanocytes, and house some other structures. The epidermis was made of epithelial cells. The dermis is made mostly of connective tissue. Within this dermis, I talked about the erector pili muscle, so this little muscle right here that grabs onto the hair root and is able to pull it upwards and give us goosebumps. There are nerves for sensitivity. All of these yellow structures here are nerves. We have a lot of blood vessels, both arteries and veins. Hair follicles, sweat glands, oil glands, all sitting in the dermis. Our deepest layer of skin, the hypodermis, is sometimes called the subcutaneous layer. Here we have our adipose and areolar tissue, ultimately just providing nourishment and cushioning and support for the other two layers of skin. Technically, it's not considered part of the skin. It's more just connective tissue underneath it, but it relates to the dermis and hypodermis, the dermis and epidermis, so I included it. Your case study for this unit talks about vitiligo, which is a condition in which your melanocytes stop producing pigment. The woman you're looking at here, her name is Winnie Harlow, and she is a model, but a lot of other celebrities have had vitiligo. I know Michael Jackson had vitiligo, and you will be sort of learning about what happens in people with vitiligo, why do they have it, how much does it progress, etc.